One cold February morning in Billings, Montana, my daughter-in-law Jessica looked me straight in the eye and said, "Eleanor, from now on, you'll need to use the back entrance when you visit. The front door is for family and guests." I stood there on the porch I had built with my own hands 43 years ago, holding a casserole dish that was still warm from my oven, watching snowflakes settle on the welcome mat I had embroidered myself. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply turned around, walked to my truck and drove away. What Jessica didn't know was that I had just made the most important decision of my life. By the time she realized what had happened, I was already gone, and the only door she'd be using was the back exit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor May Patterson, and at 78 years old, I've learned that some stories don't begin with drama. They begin with work. Hard, honest, back-breaking work that leaves calluses on your hands and pride in your chest. This story starts in 1952, when I was 26 years old and married to Robert Patterson, a man who believed that a house wasn't just shelter, it was a promise to the future. We bought 67 acres of raw Montana land for $800. It was nothing but rolling hills, prairie grass, and a determination that stretched as wide as the big sky above us. Robert worked construction during the day, and I taught second grade at the one-room schoolhouse in town. Every evening after work, every weekend, every spare moment we had, we were out there building our dream with our own hands. I learned to mix concrete that winter. My fingers cracked from the cold, but I kept working because every foundation stone we laid was a piece of our legacy. Robert and I poured that foundation together, level by level, making sure it was strong enough to hold not just walls and a roof, but generations of memories. We built the frame in the spring of 1953, cutting each board to size, measuring twice, hammering once. I can still feel the weight of that hammer in my palm, still remember the satisfaction of driving a nail home perfectly straight. Evie, the front door was the last thing we installed. We had saved for months to buy solid oak, and we stained it a deep mahogany that gleamed like honey in the Montana sun. Robert carved our initials into the wood, small and discreet, just below the mail slot. E.M. and R.J. Patterson, 1953. That door wasn't just an entrance, it was a statement. It said that the Pattersons had arrived, that we had built something lasting, something real. We painted the house white with green shutters, because I loved the way it looked against the golden wheat fields that surrounded us. Robert built a wraparound porch with his own hands, complete with carved posts and a swing that faced west toward the Beartooth Mountains. Every nail, every board, every careful measurement was an act of love, not just for each other, but for the life we were creating. The first winter in that house nearly broke us. The pipes froze twice, and we learned to leave the faucets dripping on the coldest nights. The wind came down from Canada like a freight train, rattling the windows we had installed ourselves. But we were warm inside our solid walls, sitting by the stone fireplace Robert had built, reading by lamplight while snow piled up against our front door. I was pregnant that first winter. Morning sickness hit me hard, but I still got up before dawn to make Robert's coffee and pack his lunch. He would kiss my forehead and say, "Take care of yourself and our little one, Ellie. This house is going to raise strong children." He was right. Our son David was born in that house in July of 1954, delivered by Dr. McKinnon in our bedroom upstairs. The first sound David ever heard was the wind singing through the cottonwood trees Robert had planted the year before. We raised David in every corner of that house. He took his first steps across the kitchen floor. I had laid tile by tile. He learned to read sitting on the living room rug I had braided from old clothes during the long winter evenings. His height was marked in pencil on the doorframe of the pantry, a growing record of time passing and dreams coming true. When David was 12, Robert taught him how to replace the boards on the front porch, the same way Robert's father had taught him carpentry. "A man takes care of what's his," Robert would say, "and this house will be yours someday." They worked together every Saturday, Robert showing David how to sand with the grain, how to choose the right nail for each job, how to fix things instead of replacing them. The house grew with us. Robert added on a sunroom when I turned 40, complete with windows that caught the morning light and shelves for my collection of African violets. He built me a workshop in the barn where I could pursue my woodworking hobby, and I crafted furniture for every room: a dining table that could seat 12, bookshelves that lined the hallway, a hope chest for the daughter we never had but always hoped for. Every improvement, every addition, every small repair was done with careful thought and lasting quality. We weren't wealthy people, but we were rich in time and determination. We planned each project for months, saved every penny, and did the work ourselves because we wanted it done right. The house wasn't just our home, it was our masterpiece. Robert passed away on a Tuesday in March of 2019, in the bedroom where our son had been born 65 years earlier. His last words to me were, "Take care of our house, Ellie. It's got good bones." I held his hand and promised him I would, never imagining that 5 years later, I'd be fighting to keep that promise against his own son. After the funeral, David and Jessica moved in with me. It seemed like the natural thing to do. The house was too big for just me. They were struggling with rent in town, and I thought having family close would help fill the silence Robert's absence had left behind. Jessica was pregnant with their second child, and David talked about how nice it would be for the kids to grow up in the house where he'd been raised. I was grateful for their presence at first. The house felt alive again, with children's laughter echoing through the halls. 2-year-old Madison reminded me so much of David at that age, all curiosity and boundless energy. But as the months passed, I began to notice small changes. My furniture was moved to make room for their things. My daily routines were interrupted by their schedules. My quiet morning coffee on the front porch was disrupted by Jessica's phone calls and Madison's early morning cartoons. The changes were gradual, so subtle that I didn't recognize the pattern until it was too late. It started with convenience. Jessica needed to rearrange the living room for the baby gear. David needed to move my sewing machine to make room for his home office. My collection of Robert's woodworking tools was relocated to the basement to make space for Jessica's exercise equipment. Each request seemed reasonable on its own. Each small concession felt like simple family accommodation. But slowly, systematically, I was being edited out of my own home, erased from the spaces I had helped create with my own hands. The house that Robert and I had built as a testament to our love was becoming a stage where I was no longer the leading character. I was becoming a background player in the story of my own life. I told myself it was temporary adjustment. I told myself that family meant compromise. I told myself that the alternative, living alone in a house full of memories, was worse than this gradual displacement. But, deep in my chest, in the place where truth lives even when we don't want to acknowledge it, I knew something fundamental was shifting. The question wasn't whether I belonged in my own home anymore. The question was whether I had the strength to fight for what Robert and I had built with our own hands. Board by board, nail by nail, dream by dream. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first time Jessica suggested I use the side entrance, it was because they were hosting David's work colleagues for dinner. "Eleanor, would you mind coming through the mudroom tonight? We've got everything set up so nicely in the front hall, and you know how these corporate types are about first impressions." Her voice carried that particular tone I was learning to recognize. Sweet on the surface, but with an underlying current that suggested disagreement wasn't really an option. I was carrying a tray of my famous huckleberry scones, still warm from the oven, planning to arrange them on the good china before the guests arrived. The side entrance meant walking around the entire house, past the tool shed and Robert's old workshop, through the mudroom where we kept boots and coats. It meant entering my own home like hired help. "Of course, dear," I heard myself say, though something twisted uncomfortably in my stomach. "That makes perfect sense." I watched through the kitchen window as Jessica arranged store-bought appetizers on my grandmother's silver serving tray. She had removed the family photos from the front hall table and replaced them with a modern floral arrangement she'd ordered online. The entrance that Robert and I had designed to welcome visitors with warmth and personality had been transformed into something that could have come from a magazine. Beautiful, but impersonal. During dinner, I served the meal I had spent all day preparing while Jessica accepted compliments as though she had cooked it herself. When David's boss mentioned how delicious the roast was, Jessica smiled graciously and said, "Thank you, it's a family recipe." Technically true, I suppose, but the family member who had perfected that recipe over 30 years was standing invisible in the corner, refilling water glasses. That night, as I cleaned the dishes alone while they entertained in the living room, I noticed that my apron had a small stain from the gravy. Jessica had purchased new dish towels that matched her color scheme, relegating my hand-embroidered ones to a drawer. Even in my own kitchen, surrounded by appliances I had chosen and countertops I had saved for, I felt like I was trespassing. The pattern established itself slowly, like water wearing away stone. Jessica began to redirect deliveries to the back door, to keep the front entrance clear. The mailman, who had been placing mail in the brass slot Robert installed in 1953, was instructed to use the box at the end of the driveway instead. My weekly grocery delivery from Patterson's Market, a service I had used for 15 years, was rerouted to the service entrance. "It's more efficient this way," Jessica explained when I questioned the change, "and it keeps the front of the house looking pristine." Pristine. The word stung more than I expected. As though the life Robert and I had lived here, the family we had raised, the memories we had created were somehow messy imperfections to be cleaned away. The photo albums were the next to disappear. Jessica was reorganizing the living room, creating what she called a more contemporary aesthetic. The wall that had displayed 60 years of Patterson family history was painted over in a neutral beige, decorated instead with abstract art she had purchased at a home goods store in Billings. Our wedding photo, David's baby pictures, Christmas mornings, birthday parties, family reunions, all of it boxed up and moved to the basement for safekeeping. "We can always look at them when we want to," Jessica assured me, "but guests don't really want to see other people's personal photos, you know." I wanted to argue that this wasn't a hotel lobby or a model home. This was a family residence, a place where personal history should matter more than curb appeal. But something in Jessica's tone, in the way she had already begun moving on to the next topic, told me the decision wasn't up for discussion. My morning routine became a carefully choreographed dance around their preferences. I had always been an early riser, enjoying my coffee on the front porch as the sun came up over the wheat fields. But Jessica's newborn had a different schedule, and my movements apparently disrupted their sleep. The solution, according to Jessica, was simple. I could have my morning coffee in the kitchen instead. "It's really the same thing," she said with that practiced smile. "You can see the sunrise just as well from the kitchen window." But it wasn't the same thing at all. The front porch had been where Robert and I shared our first cup of coffee as newlyweds in 1953. It was where we had planned every major decision of our lives, where we had watched David learn to ride his bicycle, where Robert had proposed adding the sunroom. The kitchen window offered a view, but the porch offered a connection to the land we had claimed and the life we had built on it. I adapted because that's what I had always done. When Robert worked double shifts during the lean years, I managed the household alone. When David went through his rebellious teenage phase, I adjusted my expectations and found new ways to connect with him. When Robert's arthritis made it hard for him to do the physical labor he loved, I learned to use power tools so we could continue our projects together. Adaptation was survival, and I was a survivor. But this felt different. This felt like erasure. The breaking point came during Madison's third birthday party. Jessica had planned an elaborate event with a princess theme, complete with hired entertainment and catered food. She had spent weeks preparing, transforming the backyard into what she called a magical kingdom. The house itself was decorated with pink and purple streamers, balloons in every corner, and an elaborate table setup that would have impressed a professional party planner. I had been looking forward to this celebration for weeks. Madison was at that perfect age where everything was wonder and possibility, and I had spent hours knitting a special sweater for her favorite doll, complete with tiny pearl buttons and delicate lace trim. I had also prepared my grandmother's chocolate cake recipe, the same one I had made for David's birthday every year until he left for college. The morning of the party, I dressed carefully in my best blue dress, the one I usually saved for church and special occasions. I pinned my grandmother's cameo brooch to the collar and took extra time with my hair, braiding it into a neat chignon. I wanted to look like the grandmother Madison deserved, the matriarch of a family celebrating together. When I walked toward the front door, carrying Madison's gift and my contribution to the refreshment table, Jessica intercepted me in the hallway. "Eleanor, I hate to ask this, but would you mind using the back entrance today? We have photographers coming, and I've staged the front entrance perfectly for photos. You understand, right?" I stood there, holding my granddaughter's carefully wrapped gift, wearing my best dress and my grandmother's jewelry, being told that my presence would somehow disrupt the perfection of my own home. The photographers weren't documenting a family celebration. They were creating a curated image of family life, and apparently I didn't fit the aesthetic. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? "I'll just go around back." The walk around the house felt longer than usual. I passed Robert's workshop, now padlocked shut because Jessica worried that Madison might hurt herself on the tools. I passed the garden, where I had spent 40 years growing vegetables for our family's table, now largely ornamental because Jessica preferred to buy organic produce from the farmer's market. I passed the tire swing that David had outgrown decades ago but that Robert had never taken down because he hoped for grandchildren who might use it. When I entered through the mudroom, I could hear the party already in full swing in the backyard. Professional photographers were directing guests into poses, and Jessica's voice carried clearly as she explained the party's theme to arriving families. I set my gift on the kitchen counter and arranged my homemade cake alongside the store-bought desserts that had been delivered earlier. No one noticed when I slipped out to the backyard. Madison ran over to hug me, and her joy made everything else fade for a moment. But as the afternoon progressed, I realized I had become peripheral to the celebration. I wasn't included in the group photos. My chocolate cake remained largely untouched, while guests gravitated toward the elaborate cupcake tower Jessica had ordered. When gift opening time came, Madison's hand-knitted sweater was quickly set aside in favor of the more impressive toys and electronics that other guests had brought. That evening, as I helped clean up the party debris, I overheard Jessica talking to her sister on the phone. She was recounting the day's events, describing how perfectly everything had gone, how beautiful the photos would be, how impressed all the other mothers had been with her planning and execution. She mentioned the catered food, the professional entertainment, the Instagram-worthy decorations. She didn't mention my cake, my gift, or my presents at all. I finished loading the dishwasher and retreated to my room, where I sat by the window looking out at the land Robert and I had claimed 50 years ago. The wheat fields stretched to the horizon, golden in the setting sun, exactly as they had when we first saw this place and knew we were home, but everything else felt different now, foreign, like I was visiting someone else's life instead of living my own. That night I pulled out the deed to the property and read through it carefully for the first time in years. Eleanor May Patterson and Robert James Patterson, it read in legal black ink. 50-50 ownership, right of survivorship. After Robert's death, the property had transferred entirely to me. On paper, at least, this was still my home. But papers don't tell the whole story. Legal ownership doesn't guarantee emotional belonging. And as I sat there in the dark, listening to my son and daughter-in-law discuss their plans for updating the house in the room below mine, I began to understand that possession and home were not the same thing at all. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from Canada with a vengeance that reminded me why Montana farmers respect the weather above all else. By November, snow had already piled 3 feet deep against the north side of the house, and the wind carried that particular bite that warned of a long, hard season ahead. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the chill that had settled inside the walls Robert and I had built to shelter our family. It was during the first blizzard of the season that Jessica made her announcement. I was in the kitchen, making vegetable soup from the last of my garden harvest, carrots, potatoes, and onions. I had grown in soil Robert and I had enriched with 40 years of compost and care. The house smelled like home should smell. Warm bread, simmering broth, and the faint scent of wood smoke from the fireplace Robert had built stone by stone. Jessica entered through the front door, stamping snow from her designer boots onto the mat I had hooked from wool scraps during the winter of 1978. She was returning from what she called her wellness consultation with Dr. Morrison in town, though why a perfectly healthy 34-year-old needed wellness consultations was beyond my understanding. "Eleanor, we need to talk," she said, settling into the kitchen chair that had been Robert's favorite spot for morning coffee. She didn't ask if I was busy. She didn't wait for me to finish stirring the soup or turn down the heat. She simply began speaking as though my activities were automatically secondary to whatever she had to say. "Dr. Morrison and I discussed the living situation here, and we agree that some boundaries need to be established for everyone's well-being." She paused to check her phone, scrolling through messages while she spoke. "Starting this week, we're implementing a few household guidelines to make things run more smoothly." Guidelines. As though this were a boarding house and she were the landlord setting rules for tenants. First, the front entrance will be reserved for family and invited guests only. This includes deliveries, service calls, and daily comings and goings. There's nothing personal about it. It's just more practical for maintaining the space. I set down my wooden spoon carefully, the one Robert had carved for me from a piece of cherry wood during our second winter here. "Jessica, honey, this is my home. I've been using that front door since before you were born." Her smile never wavered, but something sharp flashed in her eyes. "Of course it's your home, Eleanor. No one's questioning that. But we're all living here together now, and we need systems that work for everyone. The back entrance is perfectly functional, and it's actually closer to your bedroom anyway." Closer to my bedroom. As though the geography of convenience mattered more than the principle of belonging. "Second," she continued, consulting a list she had written on her phone, "we need to coordinate kitchen usage to avoid conflicts. I'll be handling all meal planning and preparation from now on, since I have specific dietary requirements for the children and David's health concerns." David's health concerns. This was news to me. As far as I knew, my son was as healthy as the day he graduated high school, aside from the slight paunch that came from Jessica's preference for ordering takeout instead of cooking real meals. "I've been cooking in this kitchen for 47 years, I said quietly. "I think I know how to feed a family." "Oh, absolutely. And we're so grateful for everything you've done. But times change, and nutrition science has advanced so much since your generation learned to cook. Dr. Morrison recommended some specific protocols, and it's just easier if I handle all the food preparation, since my generation learned to cook." As though the meals that had nourished Robert through 38 years of hard physical labor, that had seen David through childhood illnesses and growth spurts, that had fed 3 generations of harvest crews and Christmas celebrations, were somehow inferior to whatever Dr. Morrison had found on the internet. Third, we need to establish quiet hours. Madison's sleep schedule is very important for her development, and the baby needs consistent nap times. From 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., we need minimal noise in the common areas. That means no television, no phone calls, and please be mindful of footsteps on the hardwood floors. Minimal noise. In the house where Robert and I had raised a child, hosted countless family gatherings, and lived full, rich lives that didn't pause for arbitrary quiet hours. "Jessica," I began, trying to keep my voice level, "I understand that children need routine, but—" "Fourth," she interrupted, not looking up from her phone, "we'll need to streamline the common spaces. I've hired an organizer to help with decluttering. She'll be here next week to assess what items we need to keep and what can be donated or stored elsewhere." An organizer. To assess the belongings in my own home. To decide which pieces of my life were worth keeping and which were clutter to be eliminated. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "This isn't a shared living situation. This is my house. Robert and I built it, we paid for it, and I own it outright." Jessica finally looked up from her phone, and her expression was one I hadn't seen before. Not the practiced sweetness or the concerned daughter-in-law act. This was something cooler, more calculating. "Eleanor, of course you own the house. But let's be realistic about the situation. You're 78 years old, living alone in a 4-bedroom house that's becoming more than you can manage. David and I have invested significant time and money into improvements here. We've made this our home too, and our children's home. Surely you can see that some cooperation is necessary for this arrangement to work for everyone." The way she said arrangement made it clear that my ownership was, in her mind, more of a technicality than a reality. The improvements she mentioned, the new paint, the modern fixtures, the furniture that had replaced pieces Robert and I had chosen together, weren't gifts or contributions. They were investments, claims on a property she had decided would eventually be hers. "I never asked for this arrangement," I said quietly. "You needed a place to live, and I offered. But I didn't agree to become a guest in my own home." "No one's asking you to be a guest." Her voice took on that particular tone that people use when they're being reasonable with someone they consider unreasonable. "We're asking you to be considerate, to think about what's best for the family as a whole, instead of just yourself. Just myself." As though standing up for basic dignity in my own home was selfishness. As though 47 years of putting family first meant nothing if I balked at using the back door like hired help. The soup was boiling over. I turned to rescue it, ladling the excess back into the pot, wiping the stovetop clean. When I turned back around, Jessica was texting someone, her fingers flying across the screen with practiced efficiency. "I've already scheduled the organizer for Tuesday," she said without looking up. "And I'll have David move your television to your bedroom so you can watch whatever you want without disturbing the children." My television, the one Robert and I had saved for 3 months to buy, chosen specifically for the living room we had designed around evening family time. The one we had watched the moon landing on, the one that had brought us news of the Berlin Wall falling, the one where we had cheered David's high school football team to a state championship. "Jessica, I think you need to slow down and—" "Oh," she looked up suddenly, as though just remembering something important. "And Eleanor? Dr. Morrison mentioned that elderly people sometimes have trouble with change, so if you're feeling resistant to these adjustments, we can look into some resources that might help. There are counselors who specialize in aging transitions. As though my objection to being demoted in my own home was a medical condition, rather than a rational response to unreasonable demands. That evening, David came home from his job at the county assessor's office, stomping snow from his boots in the mudroom. He had always been a good man, my son, but somewhere along the way he had learned to let Jessica make the decisions and then support them, rather than question them. It was easier that way, I suppose. Less conflict, less disruption to the peace she had created by eliminating any voice that might disagree with hers. "Mom just told me about the new household arrangements," he said, hanging his coat on the hook Robert had installed in 1953. "I think it makes sense. It'll be better for everyone." Better for everyone. The phrase that had become Jessica's trump card, the one that made any disagreement sound petty and selfish. "David," I said carefully, "this is still my house. I never agreed to any of these rules." He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, the way he had as a child when he'd been caught in some minor mischief. "I know, Mom. But we're all living here together, and Jess has some good ideas about making it work better. The kids need structure, and you could probably use some help managing everything anyway." Some help managing everything. As though I had been failing at running my own household for the past 5 years since Robert's death, rather than maintaining it exactly as it had always been maintained. "I don't need help managing my own home, David. I know you don't think you do. But things are different now. You're getting older, and this house is a lot of work. Jess is just trying to make it easier for everyone." Easier for everyone. There it was again. The magic phrase that transformed control into consideration, that made resistance sound unreasonable. That night, I sat in my bedroom, the same room where Robert and I had slept for 46 years, where we had whispered our dreams and fears in the darkness, where he had died holding my hand 5 years earlier. I could hear Jessica and David in the living room below, discussing their plans for the house, their voices drifting up through the floorboards like smoke. They were making lists, dividing up responsibilities, planning improvements. They spoke about we, and our, and us, as though I were already gone, as though my presence were a temporary inconvenience rather than the rightful position of the homeowner. I pulled out the deed again, reading my name in black ink, Eleanor May Patterson. Sole owner. Fees simple, absolute. The legal language was clear and unambiguous, but as I listened to my son and daughter-in-law plan my life without consulting me, I began to understand that legal ownership and actual control were not the same thing at all. Outside my window, snow continued to fall on the land Robert and I had claimed 50 years ago. The wheat fields lay dormant under their white blanket, waiting for spring to call them back to life. But inside this house we had built with our own hands, I was beginning to realize that I might not survive the winter. Not physically. I was still strong enough to outlast Jessica's youth and David's compliance. But spiritually, emotionally, I was being slowly erased, one household guideline at a time. The woman who had built this life, who had earned her place at this table, who had paid for every board and nail with decades of love and labor, was being systematically written out of her own story. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The organizer arrived on schedule, just as Jessica had promised. Her name was Harmony, of course it was, and she drove a white SUV with Serenity Spaces, Mindful Home Solutions, painted on the side in flowing script. She was younger than Jessica, probably fresh out of some online certification program, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of confident smile that comes from never having to fight for anything in your life. I watched from the kitchen window as she and Jessica walked through my front door together, chattering like old friends. They didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. Jessica had given Harmony a key, my key, so she could get started early while Eleanor is at her morning appointment. Except I didn't have a morning appointment. I had deliberately stayed home to be present when this stranger went through my belongings. But Jessica had told Harmony I wouldn't be there, probably hoping to avoid any, quote, elderly resistance to change, as Dr. Morrison had so professionally put it. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," Harmony called out when she spotted me in the kitchen. "I'm so excited to help create some breathing space in your beautiful home." Breathing space. As though 47 years of carefully chosen belongings were somehow suffocating the house Robert and I had built. "Actually, I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care. "I didn't request any organizing services." Jessica appeared in the doorway, her expression flickering briefly before settling into that practiced concern. "Eleanor, we discussed this yesterday. Remember, the streamlining project?" The way she said remember carried just the slightest emphasis, the kind that suggested my memory might not be entirely reliable. It was a technique I recognized from my years as a teacher, the gentle undermining of authority that made resistance seem unreasonable. "I remember you telling me about it," I said clearly. "I don't remember agreeing to it." Harmony looked between us, uncertainly, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. This wasn't the smooth operation Jessica had probably described to her. "Well," Jessica said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, "why don't we just start with one room and see how it goes? Harmony has some wonderful ideas about creating flow and reducing visual clutter. Visual clutter. The photographs of Robert and me on our wedding day. The vase David had made in high school pottery class. The quilted wall hanging my grandmother had stitched during the Depression. All of it reduced to visual clutter in the eyes of a stranger with a tablet. "Let's begin with the living room," Harmony said brightly, apparently deciding to proceed despite the obvious tension. I can already see some opportunities for creating a more intentional space. I followed them into the room where Robert and I had spent countless evenings, where we had taught David to play chess, where we had wrapped Christmas presents every December for 46 years. Harmony was making notes on her tablet, photographing different angles of the room, commenting on unnecessary duplicates and expired functionality. "These books, for instance," she said, gesturing toward the built-in shelves Robert had constructed during the winter of 1967. "When was the last time any of these were actually read?" She was pointing at my collection of poetry books, volumes I had accumulated over decades of teaching and reading. Robert Frost, Emily Dickinson, Maya Angelou, voices that had sustained me through difficult seasons and celebrated with me during joyful ones. "I read them regularly," I said quietly, "but you could access all of these digitally now. Think of the space we could create by removing all these physical books. We could install some beautiful decorative objects instead, maybe some plants to bring in natural energy." Natural energy. To replace books that had been my companions for 50 years. "Those books stay where they are," I said, my voice carrying more steel than I had intended. Harmony glanced at Jessica, who stepped forward smoothly. "Of course, Eleanor. We're not getting rid of anything you really want to keep. We're just exploring options for creating a more peaceful environment." But even as she spoke, Harmony was making notes on her tablet, marking items with little symbols that looked suspiciously like a sorting system. Keep, donate, store elsewhere. My life was being categorized by a stranger who saw function where I saw memory, clutter where I saw connection. The worst moment came when Harmony picked up the wooden jewelry box Robert had made for my 50th birthday. It sat on the mantelpiece above the fireplace he had built, holding the simple wedding ring I still wore, and a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my mother. "This is sweet," Harmony said, turning the box over in her hands. "But the style is very dated. We could replace it with something more contemporary, maybe in a metallic finish that would complement the new color scheme Jessica mentioned." The new color scheme. The one that would paint over 47 years of choices Robert and I had made together. "Put that down," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. Everyone froze. Harmony looked genuinely startled, as though the idea that I might have strong feelings about my possessions had never occurred to her. Jessica's mask slipped just enough to show the annoyance underneath. "Eleanor, there's no need to be hostile," Jessica said in the tone she might use with Madison during a tantrum. "Harmony is just doing her job. Her job is to go through my belongings without my permission and decide what's worth keeping in my own home. Her job is to help create a more functional living space for everyone," Jessica replied, that dangerous edge creeping into her voice. "But if you're going to be difficult about every single suggestion, maybe we should postpone this until you're feeling more cooperative." Difficult. Uncooperative. The words that had become Jessica's weapons whenever I showed any sign of resistance to her control. Harmony was quietly packing up her tablet, clearly uncomfortable with the tension she had walked into. Maybe I should come back another time when everyone's had a chance to discuss the goals for the project. "That won't be necessary," Jessica said crisply. "I'll call you to reschedule." After Harmony left, Jessica and I stood in the living room facing each other across 47 years of accumulated life. The afternoon light was streaming through the windows Robert had installed himself, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors we had refinished together 3 times. "I don't understand why you're making this so difficult," Jessica said, her composure finally cracking. "We're trying to help you. This house is becoming overwhelming for someone your age, and we're offering solutions." "I don't want your solutions," I said simply. "I want my home. This is still your home. No one's taking anything away from you. We're just trying to make it work better for everyone who lives here. Everyone who lives here. As though we were all equal tenants rather than family members in the home I owned." "Jessica, let me be very clear about something," I said, my teacher's voice emerging after decades of retirement. "This house belongs to me. Not to you, not to David, not to your children. Me. Every stick of furniture, every book on those shelves, every photograph on these walls, they're mine to keep or discard as I see fit. And I see fit to keep them exactly where they are." Her face went through several expressions before settling on something I had never seen from her before. Genuine anger, undisguised by sweetness or concern. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Keep your cluttered old house exactly the way it is. But don't expect the rest of us to tiptoe around your attachment to junk just because you can't accept that times change." Junk. The life Robert and I had built together was junk in her eyes. "And another thing," she continued, apparently deciding that diplomacy was no longer necessary, "this whole resistance to reasonable household rules has to stop. David works hard to support this family, and I work hard to create a peaceful environment for our children. We're not going to let your need to control every detail derail what we're building here, what they were building, in the house Robert and I had already built." That evening, David came home to find the living room exactly as it had been that morning, but the atmosphere in the house fundamentally changed. Jessica met him at the door, the front door, naturally, with a summary of my unreasonable behavior and my refusal to cooperate with basic improvements. I listened from the kitchen as she painted a picture of an elderly woman clinging to the past, unable to adapt to family life, making everyone else miserable with my stubborn attachment to outdated belongings and routines. She was good at it, I had to admit. She presented herself as the patient, reasonable daughter-in-law trying to help an aging mother-in-law who was too proud to accept assistance. "I'm really worried about her mental state," I heard her tell David. The way she reacted to Harmony was completely disproportionate. Dr. Morrison mentioned that sudden behavioral changes can be early signs of cognitive decline. cognitive decline. Now, my refusal to let a stranger reorganize my home was evidence of mental deterioration. "Maybe we should give her some space," David said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let her adjust to the idea gradually." "David, we can't keep walking on eggshells around her mood swings. The children are starting to notice the tension, and it's not fair to them. Madison asked me yesterday why Grandma Ellie seems angry all the time." "I wasn't angry all the time. I was angry now, in this moment, after months of systematic erosion of my place in my own home." But Jessica had reframed my legitimate grievances as personality flaws, my reasonable boundaries as selfish demands. That night, I sat in my bedroom with the door closed, listening to the house settle around me. These walls had absorbed 47 years of conversation, laughter, arguments, and reconciliation. They had witnessed the full spectrum of family life, from Robert's last breath to Madison's first steps. They were soaked with memory and meaning, every board and nail a testament to the life we had built here. But tonight, for the first time since Robert's death, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Not because of the physical changes Jessica had made, though those stung. Not because of the rules and restrictions she had imposed, though those chafed. I felt like a stranger because I was beginning to understand that the family I had sacrificed for, the family I had sheltered and supported and loved unconditionally, no longer saw me as the matriarch deserving of respect. I was becoming the problem to be managed, the obstacle to be overcome, the inconvenience to be tolerated, until I could be removed entirely. The question was no longer whether I could reclaim my place in this house. The question was whether I wanted to keep fighting for a place in a family that had already decided I didn't belong. The week after the organizer incident marked the beginning of what I can only describe as psychological warfare. Jessica didn't shout or threaten or make dramatic proclamations. Instead, she deployed something far more insidious: the systematic weaponization of small courtesies and the careful orchestration of my daily humiliations. It started with the mail. For 68 years, I had collected my own correspondence from the brass mailbox Robert had mounted beside our front door. But suddenly, Jessica began intercepting it during her morning runs, sorting through everything before placing my portion in a neat stack on the kitchen counter. She claimed it was more efficient, that she could handle any family-related mail while ensuring I got what was specifically mine. "I just thought it would save you the trip," she said with that crystalline smile when I questioned the new arrangement. "The walkway gets so icy this time of year." But efficiency wasn't the real purpose. Control was. Jessica was now the gatekeeper of information flowing into my own home. She saw every bill before I did, every piece of correspondence, every invitation or notice. She knew about my doctor's appointments before I opened the envelopes. She knew about my modest investment statements, my property tax notices, my subscription renewals. More troubling, she began to filter what reached me. A letter from my cousin Margaret in Bozeman, whom I hadn't heard from in months, never made it to my kitchen counter pile. Neither did the invitation to the annual church bazaar planning committee, a group I had belonged to for 35 years. When I asked Jessica about these missing pieces of mail, she claimed no knowledge of them. "Are you sure you were expecting something?" she would ask with furrowed concern. "Sometimes the postal service can be unreliable, especially for less important items. Less important items. Like connections to my community and extended family." The second front in Jessica's campaign was the telephone. She convinced David to add call screening to the landline Robert and I had maintained for decades, ostensibly to protect me from telemarketers and scam artists. But the screening worked both ways. Now Jessica could monitor who was trying to reach me, and more importantly, who I was trying to reach. When I attempted to call Margaret to ask about her missing letter, the call mysteriously failed to connect. When I tried the church to inquire about the bazaar planning, I was told that Mrs. Patterson had already informed them I wouldn't be participating this year due to health concerns. Health concerns I had never expressed to anyone. "I hope you don't mind," Jessica said when I confronted her about the church call. "When they asked about the bazaar, I could tell you were feeling overwhelmed with everything happening here. I thought it would be kinder to decline for you, rather than put you in the awkward position of having to explain. Explain what, exactly? That I was losing control of my own life? That my daughter-in-law was systematically isolating me from the outside world? That I was being erased from my own existence, one phone call at a time? The third element of Jessica's strategy was the most subtle and perhaps the most effective. She began to rewrite the family narrative with me as the unreasonable antagonist. During David's evening phone calls with his colleagues, I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, offering commentary about the challenges of multi-generational living. It's so difficult when elderly parents become resistant to help, her voice would drift up from the living room. We're trying so hard to make things easier for her, but she seems to interpret every kindness as an insult. Every kindness as an insult? The phrase that reframed my legitimate grievances as ingratitude, my reasonable boundaries as hostility. She began to document what she called my episodes. If I expressed frustration about not being consulted on household decisions, Jessica would make notes about my agitation. If I insisted on cooking my own meals rather than eating her pre-planned nutrition protocols, she recorded it as, quote, food-related anxiety. If I wanted to rearrange furniture in my own living room, it became evidence of obsessive need for control. These notes, I discovered, were being shared with Dr. Morrison during Jessica's increasingly frequent wellness consultations. I found this out entirely by accident when I answered the landline before the call screening could intercept it. Mrs. Patterson? The voice was professional, clinical. This is Dr. Morrison's office confirming Jessica Patterson's appointment for Thursday to discuss her mother-in-law's behavioral concerns. I had become a medical case study in my own home. I think there's been some confusion, I said carefully. I'm Eleanor Patterson, and I have no behavioral concerns that require discussion. The silence on the other end lasted several beats too long. Perhaps I should speak with Jessica directly about the appointment details. That evening, I confronted Jessica about the doctor visits. She was in the kitchen, preparing what she called a nourishing dinner for the family, some combination of quinoa, steamed vegetables, and organic protein that looked like punishment on a plate. Jessica, I understand you've been discussing my health with Dr. Morrison. She didn't deny it, didn't look surprised that I had found out. She simply continued plating the joyless meal as though my question was a minor interruption. I've been seeking guidance about how to best support you during this transition period, she said without looking up. Dr. Morrison has experience with families navigating aging-related challenges. What aging-related challenges? I'm in excellent health. I have been since Robert died 5 years ago. Physical health, yes, but there are other considerations. Cognitive flexibility, emotional regulation, adaptation to changing family dynamics. She finally looked at me, and her expression was one of patient sympathy that made my skin crawl. It's nothing to be ashamed of, Eleanor. Many people struggle with these adjustments. Many people. As though my resistance to being controlled in my own home was a common geriatric problem, rather than a natural response to psychological manipulation. I want you to stop discussing my personal affairs with Dr. Morrison immediately. I can't do that, she said simply. As your family, we have a responsibility to monitor concerning behaviors and seek professional guidance when necessary. A responsibility to monitor me, like I was a flight risk or a danger to myself and others. The final straw came on a Tuesday evening in December. I had been in my room, reading one of the poetry books Harmony had deemed unnecessary, when I heard unfamiliar voices in the living room. I came downstairs to find Jessica hosting what she called an informal consultation with 2 women I didn't recognize. One introduced herself as Linda Brewster, a social worker who specialized in aging services. The other was Karen Mills, who apparently ran something called Senior Transitions, a local company that helped families navigate what she called difficult conversations about independence. They were sitting in my living room, drinking coffee from my china, discussing my situation as though I weren't capable of speaking for myself. The resistance to reasonable accommodations is quite common, Linda was saying. Often elderly individuals experience a sense of loss of control that manifests as hostility toward family members who are trying to help. Exactly, Jessica agreed. We've tried so many approaches, but she interprets everything as a personal attack. Yesterday, she accused me of stealing her mail, which is obviously not the case. I'm just trying to make things easier for her. Karen nodded knowingly. It's important to remember that this behavior isn't really about you. It's about her fear of losing independence. But at some point, family members have to make difficult decisions about safety and well-being. Difficult decisions about safety and well-being. Code words for overriding my autonomy entirely. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, listening to three women discuss my life, my mental state, my future, and my needs without including me in the conversation. They spoke about me in the third person, as though I were a problem to be solved rather than a person with opinions and preferences. When I finally cleared my throat to announce my presence, all three women turned to look at me with expressions of carefully modulated compassion, the kind of look people give to children or confused elderly relatives who have wandered into adult conversations. Eleanor, Jessica said brightly, perfect timing. Linda and Karen were just explaining some resources that might be helpful for our situation. Our situation. The situation where I lived in my own home that I owned outright, but was apparently incompetent to manage my own affairs. What kind of resources? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Linda leaned forward with practiced warmth. We help families explore options for aging in place safely. Or when that's not possible, we assist with transitions to more appropriate living situations. More appropriate living situations. Nursing homes. Assisted living facilities. Places where difficult, elderly people could be managed by professionals instead of inconveniencing their families. I'm not transitioning anywhere, I said quietly. This is my home. The three women exchanged glances, the kind that said they had expected exactly this response from the difficult elderly person they had been discussing. Of course, Karen said soothingly. No one's talking about immediate changes. We're just exploring options and gathering information for future reference. Future reference. When I became too troublesome for Jessica to manage with subtle manipulation and would need to be removed entirely. That night, after Linda and Karen had left with their business cards and their sympathetic smiles, I sat in my bedroom listening to Jessica brief David on the consultation. She painted a picture of concerned professionals who had validated her approaches to managing my declining situation. They both agreed that we're handling this exactly right, she told him. They said resistance is normal, but that we can't let her control the process indefinitely. Eventually, we'll need to make decisions based on what's best for everyone, not just what she wants. What's best for everyone. The phrase that had become the death knell of my autonomy. As I sat there in the dark, surrounded by the walls Robert and I had built with our own hands, I realized that Jessica's war wasn't about the house or the inheritance or even control. It was about existence itself. She wanted me to voluntarily erase myself from my own life, to disappear quietly so she could take over completely without the inconvenience of my resistance. But I had spent 78 years on this earth, 47 of them in this house. I had survived the death of my husband, raised a son, built a life that mattered. I wasn't going to disappear just because it would be more convenient for everyone else. The question was, what exactly was I prepared to do about it? The revelation came not through some dramatic confrontation or earth-shattering discovery, but through a simple manila folder left carelessly on the kitchen counter. Jessica had stepped out to pick up Madison from daycare, and David was still at work when I came downstairs to make my afternoon tea. The folder sat there like an innocuous piece of office supplies, but something about its placement felt deliberate, almost like a challenge. Inside were documents I was never meant to see, printouts from websites about managing difficult elderly relatives, articles about something called therapeutic fibbing, and redirecting aggressive behaviors in aging adults. But the most chilling discovery was a detailed timeline Jessica had been maintaining, chronicling what she called my, quote, cognitive decline indicators over the past 6 months. November 15th. Subject became agitated when asked to use alternate entrance, displayed irrational attachment to symbolic gestures. Possible early signs of rigid thinking patterns. November 22nd. Subject refused professional organizing consultation. Exhibited territorial behavior over personal possessions. Recommend evaluation for hoarding tendencies. December 3rd. Subject accused family of mail theft. Paranoid ideation increasing. May need medication evaluation. December 8th. Subject confrontational with social services consultation. Hostile to outside intervention. Cognitive flexibility severely compromised. Each entry read like a clinical report, reducing my legitimate grievances to symptoms of mental deterioration. Jessica had been building a case against my competency, creating a paper trail that would support whatever action she planned to take next. But it was the final document in the folder that made my blood run cold. A printout from the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services website, specifically the page titled, "When Adult Children Must Intervene, Legal Options for Protecting Incapacitated Parents." Incapacitated. The word sat on the page like a death sentence. I read through the criteria for obtaining guardianship over an elderly relative. Evidence of cognitive impairment. Documentation of unsafe living conditions. Testimony from medical professionals about the subject's inability to make sound decisions. Jessica wasn't just trying to control my daily life. She was building a legal case to have me declared incompetent so she could take over everything. My house, my finances, my medical decisions, my entire existence. And according to the timeline she had so carefully documented, she was getting close to having enough evidence to petition the court. I photographed every page with my old digital camera, hands shaking as I tried to keep the images steady. When I heard Jessica's car in the driveway, I quickly returned the folder to its exact position and retreated to my room. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but for the first time in months, my mind was perfectly clear. Mealy, I knew what Jessica was planning. More importantly, I knew I had to act before she could execute it. That evening, I made a phone call from the extension in my bedroom, the one Robert had insisted on installing so I could talk privately with my sister during her long illness years ago. I called Margaret in Bozeman, the cousin whose letters had mysteriously stopped arriving. "Eleanor!" Margaret's voice was warm with surprise and relief. "I've been so worried about you. I've written 3 times in the past month and haven't heard back. I was starting to think something had happened. Margaret, I need to see you. Can you come for a visit this weekend?" "Of course, honey. Is everything all right? You sound strange." "I'll explain when you get here. But Margaret, don't call the house to confirm. Just come." Margaret had been a paralegal for 30 years before retiring. If anyone could help me understand my legal options, it would be her. More importantly, she was family, real family, the kind that remembered who I was before I became Jessica's inconvenient elderly relative. She arrived Saturday morning driving her ancient pickup truck, the same one she'd owned since the 1990s. I watched from my bedroom window as she pulled up to the front door, then walked around to the back entrance when no one answered her knock. Even Margaret, it seemed, had learned that front doors weren't for everyone. "What in God's name is going on here?" were her first words when I let her in through the mudroom. She was looking around the kitchen with the sharp eyes of someone who remembered how this house used to feel when Robert was alive. I showed her everything. The timeline Jessica had compiled. The printouts about guardianship procedures. The documentation of my supposed behavioral incidents. Margaret read through it all with the careful attention of someone who understood legal implications. "Eleanor, this is serious," she said when she finished. "She's building a competency case against you. Look at this language: irrational attachment, paranoid ideation, hostile to intervention. These aren't casual observations. Someone's coaching her on exactly what terms to use." "Dr. Morrison," I said. "She's been having regular consultations with him about my aging transition challenges." Margaret's expression darkened. "Has he examined you directly? Asked you about these supposed symptoms?" "Never. Everything he knows about my mental state comes from Jessica." "That's medical malpractice waiting to happen," Margaret said grimly. "But it's also our advantage. Any competency evaluation has to include direct assessment by qualified professionals. Jessica can't just declare you incompetent based on her own observations." We spent the afternoon strategizing. Margaret explained the legal realities. In Montana, adult children could petition for guardianship of elderly parents, but they needed substantial evidence of incapacity. The process involved court hearings, professional evaluations, and appointed advocates for the elderly person. The good news is that you're clearly competent, Margaret said. The bad news is that the system is designed to err on the side of caution. If Jessica can present a compelling case that you're unsafe or making poor decisions, a judge might grant temporary guardianship while ordering more extensive evaluation. How long could that take? Months. And during that time, Jessica would have legal authority over your finances, your medical care, and your living situation. The weight of that reality settled over me like a winter blanket. Jessica could have me removed from my own home and committed to a care facility while the courts sorted out whether I was actually incompetent. By the time the truth emerged, I might be too institutionalized and isolated to fight back effectively. There is another option, Margaret said carefully. You could take preemptive action. Transfer key assets to trusted individuals. Establish clear documentation of your mental competency. Create legal barriers that would make a guardianship petition much more difficult to pursue. What kind of legal barriers? A comprehensive estate plan that demonstrates forward-thinking capacity. Medical evaluations from multiple independent physicians. Character witnesses who can testify to your mental sharpness. And, she paused, measuring her words carefully, removal of the people who are documenting your supposed incompetency from your daily environment. Removal. The word hung in the air between us, like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. You mean asking them to leave? I mean reclaiming your home and your autonomy before Jessica can use the legal system to take them away from you permanently. That evening, Margaret stayed for dinner, a meal I cooked in my own kitchen for the first time in weeks. Jessica was visibly annoyed by the presence of an unannounced guest, especially one who clearly remembered the house as it used to be and wasn't impressed by the improvements that had been made. "Margaret, how lovely to see you," Jessica said with her practiced smile. "Eleanor didn't mention you were coming." "Family doesn't need invitations," Margaret replied mildly, but her eyes were sharp as she took in Jessica's proprietary manner in the kitchen I had designed and furnished myself. During dinner, Margaret asked pointed questions about the household arrangements, the wellness consultations, and the various professionals who had been brought in to assess my needs. Each question was casual, conversational, but I could see Jessica growing increasingly uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "It sounds like you're taking wonderful care of Eleanor," Margaret said. "So many families struggle with these multi-generational living situations. Have you found it challenging, managing an elderly relative's resistance to helpful changes?" The question was a trap, and Jessica walked right into it. "Oh, it can be difficult," she said with a sigh. "Sometimes elderly people become very set in their ways, you know? They can't always see what's best for them." Margaret nodded sympathetically. "And you've been documenting these challenges? For medical purposes?" Jessica's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Just keeping track of patterns, to help the doctors understand the situation." "Very wise," Margaret said. "Documentation is so important in these cases, especially if legal intervention becomes necessary." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken recognition. Jessica realized that Margaret knew exactly what was happening, and Margaret had just made it clear that Eleanor wasn't as isolated and vulnerable as Jessica had believed. After dinner, as Margaret prepared to drive back to Bozeman, she took my hands in hers. "Eleanor, you have 48 hours, maybe 72, before she escalates this. Once she realizes there are witnesses to her behavior and people who won't accept her narrative about your incompetency, she's going to move fast." "What should I do?" "Stop being reactive and start being strategic. This is still your house, your money, your legal right to live as you choose. But you have to assert those rights before someone else convinces a judge that you're not capable of exercising them." That night, I sat in my bedroom with the deed to the property, Robert's will, and my own financial documents spread across the quilt he had bought for our first anniversary. Everything was clear, legal, and unambiguous. I owned this house. I owned the land it sat on. I had the legal right to determine who lived here and under what circumstances. The question was whether I had the courage to exercise those rights, knowing it would mean the end of any pretense of family harmony and the beginning of a war wasn't sure I could win. But as I looked around the room where Robert had died holding my hand, where we had planned our future and grieved our losses and built a life worth defending, I realized that some wars are worth fighting, regardless of the outcome. The time for accommodation and hope and family peace had passed. Tomorrow, I would stop being the problem in Jessica's house and start being the owner of my own. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline Montana sunshine that makes everything look possible. I woke up before dawn, as I had every day for the past 60 years, but this time with a purpose that felt as sharp and clear as the mountain air. Today, I would stop being Eleanor the problem and become Eleanor the property owner. My first call was to Hammond and Associates, the law firm that had handled Robert's estate planning. I had dressed carefully for the appointment, my navy blue suit, the one I used to wear to parent-teacher conferences when I commanded respect from 30 teenagers and their skeptical parents. If I was going to reclaim control of my life, I needed to look like someone who deserved to have control. "Mrs. Patterson," James Hammond said, rising from behind his oak desk when his secretary showed me in. "I haven't seen you since we finalized Robert's will. I hope everything has been going smoothly." Smoothly? If only he knew. "Actually, Mr. Hammond, I need to make some changes to my estate planning. Significant ones." I explained the situation in clinical terms, the way a teacher might describe a discipline problem to a principal. I didn't dramatize or embellish. I simply laid out the facts: the systematic documentation of my supposed incompetency, the consultation with social workers about my transition needs, the discovery of research into guardianship procedures. Hammond's expression grew progressively more serious as I spoke. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of his face. "Mrs. Patterson, what you're describing sounds like the preliminary stages of what we call predatory guardianship. It's more common than people realize, especially when property is involved. What can I do to protect myself?" "Several things, and we need to move quickly. First, we're going to establish clear, recent documentation of your mental competency. I'll arrange for you to be evaluated by Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She's a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in competency assessments for exactly these situations." He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "Second, we're going to update your estate planning documents to reflect your current wishes and circumstances. Third, we're going to create what's called a, quote, pre-need guardianship designation. Essentially, you'll legally specify who you would want as your guardian if one ever became necessary, which prevents others from petitioning for that role. And fourth?" Hammond looked up from his notes, his expression serious. "Fourth, we're going to discuss your options regarding the current living situation. Because Mrs. Patterson, based on what you've told me, your daughter-in-law's plan is quite sophisticated. She's building a case that would be compelling to a family court judge who doesn't know the full story. The full story. That my resistance to being controlled in my own home was being reframed as cognitive impairment. Mr. Hammond, can they force me out of my own house? If they obtain guardianship, yes. A guardian has legal authority over housing decisions, medical care, financial management, essentially everything. But Mrs. Patterson, you still have legal rights here. This is your property, and you have the absolute right to determine who lives in it." That afternoon, I underwent the most thorough mental health evaluation of my life. Dr. Mitchell was a small, precise woman in her 50s who asked questions that ranged from basic memory tests to complex, problem-solving scenarios. She evaluated my understanding of finances, my ability to make decisions about my own care, my comprehension of the legal implications of various choices. "Mrs. Patterson," she said when we finished, "I need to ask you directly, do you feel that your mental faculties have declined in any significant way over the past year?" Dr. Mitchell: 6 months ago, I balanced my own checkbook, managed my own medical appointments, maintained my own household, and made my own decisions about everything, from what to eat for breakfast to how to spend my money. The only thing that's changed is that other people have decided those capabilities make me difficult to manage." She nodded, making notes. "And how would you describe your living situation currently?" "I'm being systematically isolated and controlled in my own home by people who benefit from my dependence on them. They've convinced themselves, and are trying to convince others, that my resistance to this control is evidence of mental incapacity rather than a rational response to psychological manipulation. Dr. Mitchell's pen stopped moving. She looked at me with the sharp attention of someone recognizing clarity, where others had reported confusion. Mrs. Patterson, based on this evaluation, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment, dementia, or inability to make rational decisions about your own life. In fact, your analysis of your situation demonstrates sophisticated understanding of complex interpersonal dynamics. I'll have my full report to your attorney by tomorrow morning. When I returned home that evening, Jessica was waiting in the kitchen with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not the practiced sweetness or the frustrated concern, but something that looked almost like fear. "Eleanor, where were you today? We were worried when you didn't come home for lunch." Worried? As though I were a wandering patient who might get lost on my own property. "I had appointments in town," I said simply, hanging my coat in the mudroom. "What kind of appointments? Maybe next time I could drive you. These winter roads can be treacherous for someone your age. Someone my age. 78 years of Montana winters, and suddenly I was too frail to drive on roads I'd been navigating since before Jessica was born. I managed just fine," I said, walking past her toward the stairs. "Eleanor, wait." Jessica's voice carried a new urgency. "I wanted to talk to you about something. Dr. Morrison called today. He's concerned about some of the stress indicators he's been seeing in our family dynamic. He thinks it might be helpful if we all sat down together to discuss some adjustments." Adjustments. The word that had become code for my surrender. What kind of adjustments? Well, he mentioned that sometimes a change of environment can be really beneficial for elderly individuals who are struggling with transition anxiety. There's a lovely assisted living community in Billings that specializes in people who are having difficulty adapting to family situations. There it was, the final move in Jessica's chess game. She was no longer pretending this was about household harmony or family cooperation. She was openly discussing my removal. "Jessica," I said, turning to face her fully, "let me be very clear about something. I'm not struggling with transition anxiety. I'm not having difficulty adapting. I'm responding rationally to being controlled and manipulated in my own home." Her mask slipped completely then. The sweet concern vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Eleanor, I understand that change is hard, but you can't continue to disrupt this household with your refusal to accept help. The children are being affected by this constant tension. David is stressed about your behavior. We can't keep walking on eggshells around your mood swings." Mood swings. My objection to being treated like a tenant in my own house was now a psychiatric symptom. "And if I refuse to consider this assisted living suggestion?" Jessica's smile was sharp as winter ice. "Then we'll have to explore other options. Dr. Morrison has been very clear about his concerns regarding your ability to live safely without supervision. He's prepared to document those concerns formally if necessary." Formally. Legal documentation that could be used in a competency hearing. "I see," I said quietly. "And when exactly were you planning to inform me that my removal had already been decided?" "This isn't about removal, Eleanor. It's about finding the best solution for everyone. But if you can't participate in reasonable discussions about your care needs, then the decision might have to be made without your input." Without my input. About my own life in my own house regarding my own future. That night, I made 3 phone calls from my bedroom extension. First to Margaret, to let her know that Jessica had accelerated the timeline just as she had predicted. Second to Mr. Hammond, to inform him that we needed to move faster than originally planned. Third to Dr. Mitchell, to request an expedited written report. Then I sat down at the small writing desk Robert had built for me in 1967 and composed a letter. It was brief, formal, and absolutely clear. "David and Jessica Patterson, you have 30 days to find alternative housing arrangements. This house is my property, and I am exercising my legal right to determine who lives here. Your tenancy is terminated effective February 15th. Eleanor May Patterson, property owner." I placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it carefully, and set it on my nightstand. Tomorrow I would hand it to them personally, in my own kitchen, in my own house, Standing on the foundation Robert and I had poured with our own hands. Tomorrow, the war would begin in earnest. But tonight, for the first time in months, I would sleep peacefully in the bedroom where I belonged, in the house that was mine, dreaming of the day when I would walk through my own front door without asking permission from anyone. The time for being accommodating was over. The time for being strategic had begun. I delivered the letter at breakfast on Tuesday morning, February 1st. Jessica was at the stove, preparing what she called a nutritionally optimized morning meal for the family. Some combination of egg whites, organic vegetables, and supplements that looked like punishment on a plate. David sat at the table reading news on his phone. Madison played with her food, and the baby fussed in his high chair. It was a scene of domestic normalcy, the kind of family breakfast Norman Rockwell might have painted if he specialized in psychological warfare. "Jessica, David," I said, placing the sealed envelope on the kitchen table between them. "I have something for you." Jessica glanced at the envelope with mild curiosity, continuing to stir her joyless scramble. "What's this, Eleanor?" "Your notice to vacate. You have 30 days to find alternative housing arrangements." The silence that followed was absolute. David's phone clattered to the table. Jessica's wooden spoon stopped moving. Even Madison looked up from her breakfast, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. "I'm sorry?" Jessica's voice was very quiet, very controlled. "Did you just say notice to vacate?" "I did. This is my house, and I'm exercising my legal right to determine who lives here. Your tenancy is terminated effective February 15th. David found his voice first. "Mom, what are you talking about? This is our home, the kids' home. You can't just—" "I can, and I am." I remained standing, my hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I've consulted with my attorney, and my rights as property owner are clear and unambiguous." Jessica set down the spoon with deliberate care, her face cycling through expressions like a slot machine, landing on its final combination. Shock, disbelief, calculation, and finally, rage. "Eleanor, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this is insane. You can't just throw your own family out on the street because you're having some kind of episode. There it was again, the word that reduced my legitimate grievances to psychiatric symptoms. "I'm not having an episode, Jessica. I'm making a rational decision about my own property based on months of systematic disrespect and psychological manipulation." "Psychological manipulation?" Her voice rose an octave. "I've done nothing but try to help you. I've sacrificed my own comfort to make this household work for everyone. You've systematically isolated me from my community, controlled my access to mail and phone calls, documented my supposed incompetency for medical professionals, researched legal procedures for having me declared mentally unfit, and openly discussed my removal to assisted living facilities. That's not help, Jessica, that's elder abuse." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. David looked between us with the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion, unable to process what he was seeing. "Jessica," he said uncertainly, "what is she talking about?" Jessica's composure cracked completely then. "She's talking about the paranoid delusions that Dr. Morrison warned us about. This is exactly the kind of irrational thinking that proves she can't live independently anymore." "I have documentation," I said calmly, pulling a manila folder from behind my back. "Copies of your timeline tracking my supposed cognitive decline. Printouts of your research into guardianship procedures. Records of your consultations with social workers about my transition needs. Would you like me to read them aloud?" Jessica's face went white. "You went through my private papers. I found your private papers on my kitchen counter in my house, the house you're now being asked to leave." "Mom," David said, his voice strained, "even if there have been some misunderstandings, you can't just kick us out. We have nowhere to go, the kids." "The kids will adapt. Children are resilient. They'll be fine once they're living with parents who respect other people's boundaries and don't spend their time plotting to have elderly relatives declared incompetent." "That's not what we were doing," Jessica exploded. "We were trying to get you the help you obviously need. Look at yourself, Eleanor. You're paranoid, hostile, impossible to reason with. You interpret every kindness as an attack. I interpret control as control, Jessica. I interpret manipulation as manipulation. And I interpret theft of my autonomy as exactly what it is. Theft. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Robert and I had installed ourselves in 1954. This is crazy. Mom, you're being completely unreasonable. We're family. Family doesn't document each other's supposed mental decline for legal purposes. Family doesn't research how to have each other declared incompetent. Family doesn't make elderly relatives use the back door like hired help. The door thing was about practicality. The door thing was about establishing hierarchy. I cut him off. About making it clear that this wasn't my home anymore, that I was here on sufferance rather than by right. And it worked, didn't it? For months I accepted it. I told myself it was reasonable, that I should be accommodating, that family meant compromise. I looked around the kitchen Robert and I had designed together, where we had shared 46 years of morning coffee and evening conversations. Where we had fed David as a baby, celebrated his first lost tooth, helped him with homework at this same table. But compromise requires two parties willing to give something up. What did you give up, David? What did you sacrifice? You moved into my house, used my utilities, ate my food, benefited from my labor, and allowed your wife to systematically erase me from my own life. Where exactly was your compromise? David's face flushed red. We helped with expenses. We improved the house. We brought life back into this place after Dad died. You improved the house by removing everything that connected it to the life your father and I built here. You brought life back by suffocating mine. And you helped with expenses by living rent-free while planning to inherit everything through legal guardianship. That's not true. Then explain the research into competency procedures. Explain the documentation of my, quote, behavioral incidents. Explain the consultations with transition specialists. Explain Jessica's timeline tracking my supposed cognitive decline. David turned to look at Jessica, who was standing very still by the stove, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Jess? What is she talking about? Jessica's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. I was protecting our family. She's been getting worse, David. More difficult, more unreasonable. I had to document it in case something happened. In case what happened? In case we needed to prove she couldn't live alone anymore. The admission hung in the kitchen air like a confession extracted under oath. David stared at his wife as though seeing her for the first time. You were building a case against my mother. I was protecting our children's future. This house, this property, it should be theirs someday. But not if she gives it all away or makes bad decisions because she can't think clearly anymore. She seems to be thinking pretty clearly right now, David said quietly. Because she's having a lucid moment. David, you know how she's been. The mood swings, the paranoia, the refusal to accept help. The refusal to be controlled, I corrected. Jessica, I've been evaluated by a geriatric psychiatrist. Dr. Sarah Mitchell found no evidence of cognitive impairment, dementia, or inability to make rational decisions. Her report is on file with my attorney. Your timeline of my supposed decline? It's evidence of your manipulation, not my incapacity. Jessica's composure finally shattered completely. Fine. You want to know the truth? Yes, I documented everything. Yes, I researched our options. Because you've made life impossible for everyone who has to live with you. You're selfish, controlling, impossible to please. We've bent over backward to accommodate your every whim, and you repay us with suspicion and hostility. I repay your control with resistance. I repay your manipulation with boundaries. And now I'm repaying your plan to have me declared incompetent with your eviction from my property. This is insane, Jessica said, her voice shaking with fury. David, say something. Tell her she can't do this. David looked around the kitchen where he had grown up, where his children had taken their first steps, where 3 generations of his family had shared meals and memories. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been grief. She can do this, Jess. It's her house. David, it's her house, he repeated, more firmly this time. We moved in because she offered to help us. We stayed because it was convenient. But it was never ours. It was always hers. Jessica stared at him as though he had betrayed everything she believed in. So you're just going to let her throw us out? Your own mother is destroying our family, and you're going to side with her? I'm not siding with anyone, David said tiredly. I'm acknowledging reality. And the reality is that we've apparently been planning to have my mother declared incompetent so we could take over her property. How is that not destroying family? That afternoon, while Jessica made frantic phone calls about rental properties and David sat in his truck in the driveway for 2 hours, I walked through my house room by room. I touched the door frames Robert had installed, the light switches he had wired, the windows we had chosen together. I stood in the center of each space and felt the memories settle around me like dust motes in afternoon sunlight. This house had absorbed 68 years of my life. It had sheltered my marriage, my motherhood, my widowhood, and finally my rebellion against becoming invisible in my own existence. Every board and nail was purchased with Robert's labor and my love. Every room held stories that belonged to me, the Walekara. In 30 days it would be mine again, truly, completely mine. That evening, I sat on my front porch for the first time in months, wrapped in Robert's old wool coat, watching the sun set over the wheat fields we had planted together in 1955. The February air was sharp with the promise of spring still months away, but I felt something warming in my chest that had nothing to do with temperature. I had used the front door to come outside. My front door. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over my land and shone through my windows, I would walk through that door again, because it belonged to me. Jessica had wanted me to use the back door, because I was supposed to be grateful for whatever access I was granted to my own life. But now Jessica would be using the back exit, permanently, because some doors only open for people who have earned the right to walk through them. And some battles, when fought at the right time with the right weapons, can be won by a 78-year-old woman who remembers what it means to own her own story. 6 weeks later, Margaret helped me plant a small garden where Jessica's exercise equipment used to sit in the sunroom. We planted tomatoes, basil, and marigolds, simple things that would grow strong roots and thrive in the Montana soil Robert and I had claimed 50 years ago. The house was quiet again, but it was the right kind of quiet. The quiet of space that belongs to you, of decisions that are yours to make, of doors that open when you turn the handle because you hold the key. And every morning, I walked through my front door to check on my garden, because front doors are for people who know they belong where they are. Nile St. Mile St. Vit, I was home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Likes.